with me. Okay, and
Well,
now I guess
Sharon,
I'm ready.
Sharon,
Dan,
you,
I apologize, but I will have to leave a little early.
Oh gosh, you're just like students. You guys are just like students.
I'm sorry, but I have to also. I'm in the same meeting Sharon is.
Oh, okay. Well,
Sorry.
no problem. I mean, that's just how we do things around here. So, I wanted to, introduce our next section that we're about to talk about. We are now going to start getting into some, some pretty, I don't want to call it crazy, but pretty unusual imagery. So far, what we've seen has been rather benign, even though the four horsemen and, these images are often used and people associate them with, events that are happening in our contemporary culture. But the one thing that Kester has said and other commentators that I've read is that, let's get away from the idea of thinking about these images as referring to, first of all, predictions, and then sequences of historical events, as if, this event happens and then this event will come after it. And then we begin, and this is where a lot of our premillennialists are from, those who are expecting a rapture. And if you remember, the word rapture does not appear in the book of Revelation, but it is alluded to. And in fact, we just read, a few references about tribulation in chapter 7, those who will survive the tribulation or live through the tribulation, or the great distress as it's referred to. So a really interesting time to be reading the book of Revelation, wouldn't you say? It will be quite interesting to see what kind of commentary comes out of the most recent events in Washington, the storming of the Bastille, the storming of the Capitol building. There's a really interesting article in the New York Times, and so the date is January 13, just appeared on the various symbols. And actually, it's not really right to call them symbols. The author calls them symbols, but they're really signs. In other words, they're adopted images that represent a group. The reason I make that distinction is that symbols are usually associated with a very well-established mythology. And so the cross is a symbol, the flag, the American flag with the narrative that goes behind that is a symbol that carries with it, a kind of a valence, a meaning. But there are a number of signs that these groups, these right-wing alternative political groups are using, the Proud Boys and others. And the New York Times article does a really good job of kind of parsing those out. And the one thing that I didn't realize is just how many of them there were. And frankly, that creates a kind of a hope that this will not be as significant as it appears to be, because you know how people are. If you've got a bunch of groups trying to work together, usually they'll end up fighting amongst themselves more than they will against their common foe. And that is likely to happen if we continue on with this. But anyway, be on the lookout for how people will be interpreting the events of last Wednesday. Just think, we could have been meeting last Wednesday when all that was going on, and about the time that we would have been meeting, and that was happening. And so I don't know if we'll have anything quite as monumental today to be missing. Oh yes, that's right. The impeachment vote is happening. Well, I'm sorry to keep you with our text here. I want to back up and just remind us where we've been. Just a very brief introduction to chapter 8. Well, first of all, let me stop and see are there any comments that anyone would like to make. I don't want to be the sole commenter here, or commentator. uh, about where we are. Oh, there's Jane and there's
Mhm.
Jane and Dwight. Good.
Mhm.
Good to
Hello.
see you.
Dan,
Yeah, go ahead, Denny.
using Mark Davis's terminology, would the word poetic work in the context of these images, better than, the way they're taken by the Left Behind
Yeah.
MLA bunch?
Denny, can I interrupt you very briefly? Would
Sure.
would you all mind muting yourselves, because I'm hearing a beeping of some
Mhm.
sort that's coming through, and so let's kind of stick with that plan of if you're listening, then you're muted. If you want to talk, then unmute. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, Denny.
No, that's my heart rate. Don't worry about it. It's thinking about the impeachment. That's my heart rate. I'm kidding.
Well, it sounds like a heart rate, actually. So,
I have no idea what it is.
okay. But you go ahead and say what you said before. I'm sorry. It's just,
Well, Mark Davis in his book, Left Behind and Loving It, says we need to see this as poetry and not
yeah,
literalism.
right. And that's one thing that our authors are going to try to emphasize as well, because if you start looking at these visions as sequences of events, you will soon find yourself embroiled in a lot of contradictions, because the moon and the sun, the moon turns to blood, but then a few chapters later, the moon is back and just as pretty as you please, right? So we're not looking at a series of a sequence of events in that respect. Poetic is one way of looking at it. It is just a genre, and it's, it uses, some of the tools of poetry and some of, the narratives, styles and, rules of poetry, but not poetry per se. This is an apocalyptic genre that is really unique to this time period. And I've been trying in our study to point out where John of Patmos is really borrowing from previous prophets and even Jesus himself. But we've seen, and this is why we backed up and we started, a year ago, looking at Isaiah and looking at Amos and looking at Ezekiel and looking at Daniel. And there's a whole group of people who, because of the overwhelming presence of the Romans and their power, and what appears to be the loss of any hope that Jerusalem will ever be the city on the hill that it was, dreamed it would be. Apocalyptic literature pretty much rises to become what you might call a deus ex machina alternative. In Greek tragedy, when things look completely unresolvable, a god will swoop in and save the day. Well, this is what apocalyptic literature is as well. So, and they all borrow from each other. We have to stay away from this idea that this is an entirely unique set of visions unique to John. I'm going to read from chapter 7, but what I want us to think about also is that we're going to see a kind of parallelism as we read ahead. We've already looked at a set of visions that John has that involves, the 7 seals, the 4 horsemen, and, we just finished that section. Now we're going to move into another section where you have another set of visions, So the 7th seal of the first group of visions is opened, and it's like one of those Russian dolls. Out pops 7 new visions that John has. And eventually, on down the line, we're going to see a set of 7 more visions. And the visions follow this idea of 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and then 7 bowls. And the first 2 are what we might call warning judgments, God's judgment of earth that is offering warnings, to people of what is about to happen. And these signs are all around us, and not these sequence of events, but we saw with the four horsemen, the threat of external invasion, the threat of internal strife and things like that. Things that are, indicators of the end times, that God will soon make God's self present. The final set of images, however, the seven bowls, are what we might call judgments of destruction. But we're moving towards that, and we're getting into the area of the seven trumpets of the angels. So I want to remind us just where we've been. John has this vision, and remember, the throne of God that he sees in his vision is the temple. He is a very robust in his faith as a Jew, and holding fast to images from Isaiah and Ezekiel that the temple itself will, still plays a role in the final plan of God. Interestingly enough, though, and try to keep this in mind, because we're going to move to the last section of Revelation eventually, where a new Jerusalem is going to be established. But guess what? There's no temple in the New Jerusalem. So there's a transition, obviously, that takes place from a time when the temple is paramount in the imagery of John. But when we get to the New Jerusalem, that is not the case. And that brings me to a section that I wanted to be clear that we're clear on, that we talked about last time. So I'm going to read chapter 7, verses 13 through 17, just to kind of get us, prime our well a little bit where we've been. And this is still John's vision. Then one of the elders addressed me, saying, "Who are these robed in white, and where have they come from?" I said to him, "Sir, you're the one that knows." Then he said to me, "These are they who have come out of the great ordeal," often interpreted as tribulation. This is where we get our word tribulation. These are the ones who have come out of the great ordeal. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. For this reason, they are before the throne of God and worship him day and night within his temple. And the one who is seated on the throne will shelter them, the Lamb. They will hunger no more and thirst no more. The sun will not strike them, nor any scorching heat, for the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd. And he will guide them to springs of water, of the water of life, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. So this series of visions that John has ends with this very hopeful imagery. So there are a couple things that I wanted to point out, and we didn't get time to talk about them last time, and that was 2 weeks ago, so we probably forgotten about them. It's important to point out that all of these who have come through through the Great Tribulation, John is not referring to the end times, the complete denouement of history here. This is happening in the in-between time. And we might remember our conversations that we were having about Paul, talking about, when we die, what happens? Do we rest in repose until the final judgment? Or, and it was really Paul who came and said, no, we will come into the presence of Christ, and then there'll be a final judgment. So John, it's not clear if he believed this or not, but one of the ways that we can try to understand what he's describing here is that those standing before the Lamb are those who have died, and we've seen they've washed their robes in the blood of the Lamb, and they are awaiting the final judgment. In fact, they are going to watch what is going to unfold in history. So we got that to look forward to, which is nice. unless unless, as current events seem to portend, the final judgment is near. So any questions or comments about that? And please just jump in. Okay. The other thing I wanted to point out last time, isn't it interesting? Those who have white robes are those who have been purified, those who stand justified and thus sanctified before God. But isn't the imagery here really interesting? Because we all know in the Reformed tradition that justification is by grace through faith. This was Martin Luther's trope. This was Augustine. This is John Calvin. Is not by any action on our part, not by any decisions that we make, not by any moral uprightness that is part of who we are, but it's wholly by the grace of God that we become justified by the grace of God through Christ that we become justified before God. But look at the imagery, look at the way that John uses the words here, because it seems to suggest something quite different. It's not their robes have been made white by the blood of the Lamb, which would suggest a passive, a passive, participation on their part. But the imagery is very clear. Their robes, they have made them white. They themselves have made them white in the blood of the Lamb, which isn't really good Reformed theology. But in many ways, it is. We've kind of come to this place in our theology where we think that it's all about God's work. But there's this paradoxical participation, this paradoxical cooperation between human will and between the grace of God. And an image that I remember so much from seminary is from my great teacher, Dr. Jim Cook, Greek scholar. In the story where Jesus comes before a man who has a withered hand, basically his hand is paralyzed. He can't move it, right? And he has a conversation with the man, and of course, and he's going to forgive the man's sins, but he's also going to heal him first, heal him of his infirmity. And Jesus says, stretch out your hand, right? Now, we often just gloss over that as if that's not, oh, the guy's going to stretch out his hand. No, he can't stretch out his hand. It's impossible for him to do because his hand is paralyzed, completely withered. But what does the text say? The man stretches out his hand and Jesus heals it. So there's a synergy, a cooperation between human will and God's grace that happens in this act of justification. In Reformed theology, we tend to push it all upon God, but there is an obligation, there is a responsibility on the part of humans in this as well, as John would suggest. Now, I'm not so sure what Paul would say about this, but it does raise a very, very interesting theological question. And I know we're not studying theology here, but this strikes at the heart of Reformed theology and the heart of Presbyterianism. So I know there are some theologians that might want to say something about this and whether or not I've misinterpreted. I usually look to Mac Martin for these kinds of things. Anything you want to suggest, Mac?
No, I think that's, I don't disagree with anything you've said, really.
Beautiful narrative, though. Well, I did want to make sure that we talked about that before we moved on to chapter 8. And so if no one else, I'm going to read chapter 8. In fact, the chapter really isn't that long. And it comprises, it's pretty self-contained. So I'm just going to read the whole thing and then we'll comment on it, and we'll reflect on it afterwards. So John's still having his vision, and now he's going to see the second set of visions. And these are induced, you might say, by the opening of the seventh seal. Who's worthy to open the seals? The Lamb of God. The first 6 seals have been opened, and we've seen what they have shown us. And now John is going to see, like these Russian dolls, a second set of 7 images. When the Lamb opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about a half hour. And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. Another angel with a golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given a great quantity of incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar that is before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it down on the earth. And there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashings of lightning, and an earthquake. Now the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets made ready to blow them. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and they were hurled to the earth. And a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. Second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea became blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many died from the water because it was made bitter. The fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that the third of their light was darkened. A third of the day was kept from shining, and likewise the night. Then I looked, and I heard an eagle crying with a loud voice as it flew in mid-heaven, "Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth," at the blasts of the other trumpet that the 3 angels are about to blow. So these visions are coming in halves, you might say. We've just seen the first four trumpets and the first 4 visions that John has. And as we get into chapter 9, we're going to see what the eagle announces, right? But remember what I said before, these are visions not of complete and total destruction, but of warning. So there is some parallelism here with the other visions. You note in the first set of visions, the 4 horsemen came out first. And then we saw 2 more visions, and then the 7th seal was open. Now we are going to see, these 4, what we might call ecological visions are going to be presented. And then 3 more that are being announced by the eagle itself. One interesting thing here, and I'm really starting at the end, it's very interesting. The eagle, it has been recognized as a symbol of the Gospel of John. We talked about the eagle and the man and the ox and the lion as representing the 4 Gospels. The eagle in the Old Testament, the same word in the Old Testament Hebrew is for a vulture as well, but it's always a representation of destruction, of something destructive that is about to occur. But the eagle as a symbol of the Gospel of John is rather ironic here, at least, because there are no apocalyptic images in the Gospel of John. Apocalyptic images in the Gospels occur in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in the so-called synoptic Gospels. When we get to the Gospel of John, apocalypticism seems to have disappeared. Now remember, John is the later gospel that's written, and Revelation was early on believed to have been written, or at least it was argued it was written by the same person who wrote the Gospel of John. Well, one of the hurdles you're going to have to overcome is try to explain why the Gospel of John has absolutely no apocalyptic imagery. The kingdom of God in the Gospel of John is not something that's historically in the future, but the kingdom of God is present among you. It's almost as if it's this mystical presence that we all have access to. So just another example how John the Revelator and the Gospel of John are not probably written by the same person. So let me back up and take some of this now that you've heard the narrative. The Lamb opens the seal and there's silence in heaven. And this recalls really in one of the, you probably all know the hymn that comes from the Old Testament. We find it in Zephaniah and we find it in Amos, I believe. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence. Let all the earth keep silence before him. In Zephaniah 1, verse 7, be silent before the Lord God, for the day of the Lord is at hand. The Lord has prepared a sacrifice. He has consecrated his guests. And on the day of the Lord's sacrifice, I will punish the officials. But prior to this, it's almost like this calm before the storm, this silence. And then out walk these seven angels. And these are probably a reference to what at this time would have been known as the archangels. There is in the Old Testament not a very highly developed, what we might call angelology. There are angels in the Old Testament, that Jacob wrestles with an angel of God, and he, has his hip broken. Angels appear from time to time, and even Satan is referred to as an angel. But in the intertestamental period, and I'm going to ask you to think like theologians now, because you've taken this class for 2.5 years. So I'm going to ask you a question. In the intertestamental period, we see, remember, Jews are living among the Greeks and the Romans at this time. We start to see in some of the intertestamental literature, Tobit and Wisdom of Solomon, those books that are included in our Protestant Bible, references to a much more highly developed angelology. You have cherubim, you have seraphim, but at the top, you have these archangels, those who are the 7 right-hand angels of God, you might say. And don't ask me to recall all of their names. You can probably help me. Gabriel, Raphael, Michael, Uriel, and I'm always going to forget 2 of them in there. Please chime in if you can remember them. But let me ask you the theologian question, and here's how I try to get my students to think critically about this. Being cultural scholars, why do you suppose angelology is developing at this time in the 200 years prior to the coming of Jesus and in the 100 years after the time of Jesus? Any thoughts about this? I will give you a hint. Try to think about it in terms of cultural context.
Let me take a stab, which is no more than a guess.
Yeah.
That it's because of the increased influence of Greek and Roman thought.
Say more, please, Mac.
That's all I got. Damn.
What is it about Greek and Roman thought that would be that would induce this? And remember, people are reading Hesiod and they're reading, Sophocles, and they're reading, the stories, and it's very attractive. This culture that has this pantheon of gods, and every god is in charge of something. You have the god of the sea, you have the god of the sun, on down the line. And here we have Judaism that has just one God, right? And so in the midst of this Greek culture, Jews start to think about how God dispatches his or God's plans, how God carries them out. And the threat to Judaism and the Hebraic tradition for the past 2,000 years prior to this was the polytheism that they, learned from the Canaanites and from the Babylonians and Assyrians. Don't fall victim to that. But eventually what happens, because there's a natural tendency on the part of humans to want to be polytheistic, whether we believe it or not. Monotheism is counterintuitive to human beings because so many things happen that seem to be in contradiction to each other. It's very easy to explain the presence of evil in the world, for example, as a conflict between one God who's dark and one God who's light. Bring monotheism into the situation, now you've got a problem, right? Because the good God is also in charge of evil things happening. So these kinds of philosophical questions, with help from the Greek and Roman philosophers, mostly Greek philosophers, are leading Jewish theologians to start to develop this hierarchy of angels in the heavens. And what we're going to see is about the time that John is writing this hierarchy is now going to involve and include stories of angels that fall away from God in heaven. Now, we've already seen this in First Enoch, right? But whether you recognize it or realize it or not, this idea of Satan and his minions falling from heaven because they would not bow down to worship Adam, that's just now starting to come onto the scene. So this angelology is developing at this time, and we see it, in John here. These 7 archangels, well, they're not called archangels here, but there's something about their importance that tells us that they are going to be the ones who are going to announce this coming judgment. They're going to be the ones through whom God is going to dispatch this coming destruction. It's not happening just yet, but they're announcing it. They've got their trumpets to their lips, ready to go. So other comments about this or questions?
Dan?
Yeah.
To back up just a minute, can John of Patmos really escape the memory of the Mount Vesuvius cataclysmic experience 10 years earlier in terms of it, coloring his use of imagery?
Right. Yeah. Whether he experienced it or not, it was certainly part of the, common psyche at that time. That was such a destructive, cataclysmic, natural event, right? I mean, a whole city completely wiped out, and they're still excavating, parts of that city. I read just recently that some excavation took place, and they found insights into how Pompeii had organized itself at that time. But yes, in fact, we see this burning mountain idea, I think, is the second trumpet. But all of this is certainly an affirmation of the fact that God is in control and God is behind these things. That's great comfort to those who are in the white robes and those who are going to endure the so-called great ordeal that will eventually happen. But it's an affirmation of certainly God's strength, power, omnipotence, if I can use that word, just probably starting to come into usage at this time, maybe a little later, all powerfulness. But yeah, we can't get around this image of Vesuvius. It was 79 CE that happened, 78 or 79, and completely disrupted the entire Mediterranean culture. Not to mention just that, but not to mention also a number of earthquakes that took place, just so destructive that they really required the rebuilding of a lot of cities in, in Asia Minor, what we call present-day Turkey. You might recall when we were talking about the 7 cities that John sent his letters to, there were some of those that had to appeal to the Romans for funds to rebuild their cities. And I think one of them, perhaps it was Pergamum, that refused to do that. They just said, no, we're going to rebuild our city, using our own funds. But destructive earthquakes were certainly part of the collective memory of people at this time, and could play a role in what John is seeing here. But this trumpet imagery, you probably know, is not new to John of Patmos. It's used throughout the Old Testament to announce God's presence. And in Exodus 19, it's trumpets that announce God's presence on Mount Sinai, but also God's power and might. The whole story of Joshua, where the Israelites circle the city of Jericho 7 times, and they blow their trumpets, and the city comes, crashing down. All of that, a symbolic reference to God's imagery. But one thing I do want to point out here is that one of these, another angel, it's not one of the 7, is going to stand before an altar here and offer up incense to God. And let me just read that here. Another angel with a golden censer, you can see the image that you have there on the left. The golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given a great quantity of incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar that is before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. And the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth. And there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes, lightnings, and an earthquake. That which is most pleasing to God is also one of the means by which, this judgment is going to take place. The image of the censer the first time I went to a Christmas Eve service at the Episcopal Church, this was way before I moved to Hastings. Growing up in the Presbyterian tradition, you don't really get a sense of the sensual aspect of worship, the smells and bells. Music is there, of course, but on Christmas Eve, when the priest comes down waving the censer, and you smell the frankincense, and it just wafts through the cathedral, you get if you know that this incense represents or is actually carries the prayers of God's people to God, and the smell is pleasing to God. And what's happening here is that the angel is taking a great quantity of incense representing the prayers of God's people, burning those or lighting those on the altar so that the odor, the smell is pleasing to God, that God hears the prayers of God's people. But with the same means of, the praying, the coals are taken and thrown down to earth as a symbol of about what is yet to come. And so this imagery of I should say this sensual experience of the incense is one that I really regret not having in the Presbyterian Church, because it really was powerful to me. I had a really very pleasant experience with that. Now, a lot of people were coughing during this, but for me, the symbolism is incredible. Also want to emphasize, this is John appealing to the imagery of the temple once again, because what any good Jew would realize is that this angel is standing at the altar, which in the Jewish temple would stand before the Holy of Holies, where the high priest was only allowed to go on the Day of Atonement. But every day there would be prayers of the people that would be all altered up through burning incense. So the angel is burning incense on the altar that appears before the Holy of Holies, God on his throne. And this is imagery right from the temple that Jewish followers of Jesus would know quite well. And it just lends credence, I guess, support to this idea that John is very, very Jewish in his imagery and in his theology about who Jesus is. So let me stop. Are there any questions or comments that I can allow people to introduce?
Hey, Dan,
Yeah.
this is totally irrelevant now, but earlier I tried to unmute myself, but I couldn't. It's
Oh,
back in the parable of the man with the withered hand.
right, right.
We had a minister from the Reformed Church, Jim Van Hoven, and talking about the parable of the cleansing of the lepers.
Right.
And it says, as they went, they were healed. And so it's not just, he doesn't, they have to do it themselves. It's a sort of get off your butt theology. Don't just sit there waiting for the Holy Spirit to move you. Just get up and do it, for heaven's sake. And
Right.
so this was relevant back when you were talking about that. No, it's totally relevant.
This is relevant. This is relevant to us as Presbyterians, because it's really easy to fall into what Paul called an antinomianism, right? Well, there's, nothing I can do about salvation, so, it's got to be God who does it all. Well, there's this wonderful formula that we're justified by that grace, but the sanctification is where we, add our will to that justification and work out our salvation, as it's often referred to, as a kind of thank you, as a kind of gratitude to God's grace. But the question of the justification itself is where Jim Van Hoven was trying to make the same point. I know Jim. Is same seminary, and he and I are on the same page about a lot of things. It's really nice to hear his name come up. But this idea that our will is somehow paradoxically, mystically involved in that justification as well. It's hard for us to grasp because we're so founded in this idea of total depravity, right? God can take that depravity and work it towards salvation itself. I wanted to show you this image that the internet's such a great place, and a lot of the images that refer to the book of Revelation are not worth really showing to you, but I found this one helpful because it lays out the ecological aspect of the set of images, the set of visions that John is having. The first trumpet is blown, and you'll note that each of the destructive aspects of these visions refers to a third, right? A third of, let's say the earth, or a third of the sea is destroyed. This is a warning vision that John is having. Eventually the golden bowls are going to be much more destructive than this. But in many ways, this one goes hand in hand with the set of images that we just came through, where the seven seals revealed human experiences that we should look for. invasion from without, internal despair and disruption from within, hunger and war, all of those things. But now God is destroying, or I should say, God is making God's self manifest in the earth in this judgment, which really brings us to an interesting theological point, right? What in the world did the earth have to do with this? The creation is good, we thought. It's human beings who deserve the punishment, right? Why destroy the earth in this? And the question itself really reflects a kind of post-scientific understanding of who human beings are. I know it's hard to imagine, but in the Hebrew Bible, it's very much, we might say it's very much like what we understand Native American traditions to teach. There's a profound spiritual connection between human beings and the earth itself. What befalls humans befalls the earth. What befalls the earth befalls humans. So throughout the Hebrew prophets, when humans sin against God, it has its effect on the earth itself or on the landscape itself. We cannot separate those two. The earth is not just simply the stage upon which, or creation is not just simply the stage upon which salvation history is carried out, but it is part and parcel of salvation history as well. So when humans sin, the earth experiences that sin as well. Think about the story of Cain and Abel. When Cain kills his brother Abel, and God says to Cain, "Hey, where's your brother Abel?" And Abel says, "Well, hey, I'm not my brother's keeper." Interesting word there, because human beings are called to be keepers of the earth, right? Tillers and keepers. Cain uses the exact same Hebrew word. "I'm not my brother's keeper." And God says, "Oh, yes, you are. And I also know what has happened, because Cain's blood is crying out to me from the earth." The sin itself has reached up through the earth, apart from any kind of human interaction with God. So our connection with creation in our scientific culture that really focuses on objectification. I'm a subject. The world out here is objective, and thus objects that I can manipulate or observe and try to discern laws and hypothesize and do experiments with. In the Hebrew Bible, creation and humanity go hand in hand. And so there is a very strong emphasis on righteousness of human beings will naturally mean righteousness, if you can call it that, or purity of the landscape. If you come across a landscape that has been destroyed or has, suffered the consequences of, human maladies, then you know that the humans who live on that landscape are not righteous. Very, very important for us, and something that we wish we could have remembered, in the last 30 or 40 years, because our ecological problems, whether we were talking about climate change, whether we're talking about, clean air, clean water, farming practices that are not sustainable, all of those we tend to think of as scientific problems that can be addressed using our technology. What the Old Testament would say and what the New Testament would say as well. And John is kind of giving an allusion, an intimation of this, is that our ecological problems are spiritual problems. they are reflections of a person who's not righteous enough to take care of his own house or her own house. So it's incumbent upon Christians in this case to recognize that, if I can use the word righteousness, the tzedakah that's so important to the covenant, that part of righteousness is to care for your, your landscape, the creation in which you live. And for this reason, Paul says the creation waits with eager longing for the revelation of the children of God. When God comes into his own, creation will once again come into its own as well. That the sanctification of Christians means the sanctification of creation. But back to Revelation, the fact that the earth has turned away from God and that judgment is going to ensue, necessarily that judgment will be against creation as well as human beings. I know that's a great big long spout that I just gave here, but I really want to hear or see if there's anybody who would like to respond or ask a question about that.
Dan?
Yeah.
We're talking about how, Western people see themselves apart from creation. And I've heard this expression when, a white person stands and looks out at a beautiful scene. He says, "Isn't that beautiful?"
Yeah.
Whereas Native Americans say, "Aren't we beautiful?"
Yeah. Or even more to the point, Jane, and I find myself doing this sometimes too, and Will, you and I know this feeling, but I was in Indiana, and down on the Wabash River, there was this walnut tree that had to have been 100 feet tall. I mean, it had, its circumference was just huge, maybe two people. And my first thought, I hate to say this, was think of all of the veneer that could come out of that walnut tree. Think of all the wonderful furniture. Think about how much that walnut tree must be worth, right? I'm sorry, Will, maybe you're purer than I am, but but that's how we've been taught to think about these things. Mm-hmm. And I keep looking back ashamed of myself that I ever even thought about that, because I should have been saying, not just look how beautiful that is, but look how beautiful we are. We have a lot to unlearn in our culture, especially with respect to, this, not just the planet, but just the place in which we live. It's such a tall order to save the planet. Let's just start with where we live and see what we can do there. And so, that's what's called for by Scripture itself. Our righteousness means the sanctification, the purification of the landscape in which we live. Lack of that, short of that, means that landscape will suffer the consequences of our depravity. And that might be the symbolism here in this set of visions that John is referring to. But I think on that note, I don't want to start into something new, but when we return, we'll take a look at these 4 trumpets and the ecological consequences of those. The eagle's cry that is going to announce the next 3 visions, next 3 warnings of destruction, and then move on to talk about chapter 9 and 10. Is there one of the things, the reasons I'm not going to get into this is that many of these images that we're going to look at with the 7 trumpets really recall a lot of imagery from the plagues of Egypt. You can almost make one-to-one occurrence, references there, as well as images that come from Isaiah and Ezekiel and Daniel and Joel that Jesus draws upon. And I guess the argument I would make to you is that John, when writing or having this vision, no doubt has in mind the apocalyptic imagery in the vision that Jesus has and what's called his apocalyptic discourse that occurs in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but it has its foundation in Mark. So if you want to remind yourself of Mark 13 and what Jesus says about this, and comparing this with what John does, it would be a good exercise for our coming conversation. Are there any questions or comments? I really appreciate those so much. I can always count on you, Jane. by the way.
I
Dan,
count on her too.
Yes, go ahead, Denny.
I think it's important to point out that this whole image of angels keeps moving forward with I think it's the Archangel Gabriel
Right.
that comes to Muhammad. And I think it's on the Temple Mount to bring him the word of God
Right. Right.
as God's messenger. And secondly, so many of these angels, I think, are male and not
Yeah.
female. And many of them are angry. They're not angelic little make you feel good folks. And they're carrying some pretty heavy duty angry messages.
Right. And it's interesting if you ever get a chance to look at how these angels are the patron angels or the patron saints of various organizations or various people. You know, Michael, for example, the Archangel Michael is a patron saint of police officers. You know, Michael being the martial archangel who, you know, is first into battle against Satan. This angelology is also something we lost in the Reformation. I find it fascinating when even cobblers, shoemakers, farmers, they all have a patron saint, you know, in the Catholic tradition. Angelology just explodes and especially becomes important in the Roman Catholic Church. But as you know, Mac points out, all of this can't happen until a model is provided by the Greco-Roman culture in which the church finds itself at this time. They just adopt it and use it to their purposes. And the church fathers will do it in the next 3 or 4 centuries. So thank you, people. I'm going to stop the share. Thank you so much for continuing to stay with us. And let's keep Joyce Orr in our prayers because I know she's got to be going through some tough times. And so we'll look at chapter 8 and 9 next time. And then that's in Kester's book, chapter 4, I seem to remember in Kester's book. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you, Rich, by the way. Bye.